Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. And on behalf of Manitowoc Public Library and Lakeshore's United Visionaries, welcome to our community conversation this evening, which is called Civility. And through it, we're going to be exploring whatever happened to civil discourse. It seems like a pretty basic question on the surface, but it is clearly something that needs to be talked about. So before we get started, just a couple of things. I know our panelists are going to get into this a little bit more, but remember that you can join into the conversation by typing questions and comments into the comments box on either Facebook or YouTube. And the one thing that we ask, of course, is that while not everybody is going to agree on everything all the time, it's never a bad idea to be respectful and to listen and to really take in what's happening. Try not to get defensive, but above all else, be respectful. So that said, let's get started. And before we get into the meat of the presentation with our PowerPoint, why not introduce yourselves to everyone who is following along? And let's start with Luann. I'm going to take myself out of the picture.
Alrighty. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Luann Lonergan, and I'm a retired RN and a current board member of Lakeshore's United Visionaries, and I'm excited for this program.
Great. Thank you for being here.
Mm-hmm.
Who's next?
Me.
All right.
My name is Megan Marchant, and I am also on the board of Lakeshore's United Visionaries, and also excited to be having this conversation.
Thank you for being here, Megan.
I'm next.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate all the assistance I could get.
Hi, I'm Natasha Khan, and I'm the president of Lakeshore's United Visionaries.
Welcome. Good to see you.
And then I'm up. So,
all right.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Patrick Neufeld. I'm the current treasurer for Lakeshore's United Visionaries, and I think this is a valuable conversation to engage in. So thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for being here, Patrick. And I can actually figure this last person introducing themselves out all on my own, which is I'm pretty happy about that.
Hi, I'm Sonia Vasquez, and I'm a current board member of Lakeshore's United Visionaries, and I'm excited to have this panel tonight with all of you. Thanks for joining.
Awesome. Well, thank all 5 of you for being here. And just give me a second, and I will get the PowerPoint going, and we will get rolling. All right, so I turn it over to you.
You can go to the next slide. There you go.
So before we begin, welcome. So this is an opportunity to enter into a discussion that you may or may not have any experience with or have strong preconceived ideas about. So we want to talk about why we're here and why we're not here. So we are not here to change your mind about any given topic, or to intentionally make you feel any shame or any guilt. And we're not here to perpetuate any political ideology or create an us versus them mentality. We are here to have a meaningful conversation in a safe space with no judgment, in a safe environment. We're here to speak truths and share perspectives in ways that are not meant to intentionally create shame or guilt. And we welcome questions that you might have, and we want to engage in meaningful discussion and dialogue tonight.
So we have a safe space, no judgment. We honor the fact that each of us in attendance brings to the table specific lived experiences, cultural perspectives, and points of view. Our goal is to create a supportive learning environment where ideas, comments, and questions can be addressed and discussed with respect. And our intention is to educate ourselves and one another without judgment.
Patrick, we can't hear you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So in that, we have a few ground rules. The first is the speak from the I. We speak from our own personal experiences, and we don't judge or moralize the thoughts or experiences of others. We use I statements, such as I feel or in my experience, and avoiding statements that generalize or globalize experiences, such as you should.
We'd like to respect others. So some ways to do that. I will hear ideas today that may be new or different for me, and perspectives voiced may run counter to my own. As I participate and interact, I will try to take in new information without judgment and keep an open mind. Another way that we can respect others, we can say to ourselves, I will be aware of my words and body language, that they reflect a respectful attitude towards others. I recognize that we learn by listening to others. I will try to be supportive of the place each participant comes from.
And then don't assume. Please treat everyone here as an individual. Avoid tokenizing people. Please do not make assumptions about an individual's gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, class, ability, religion, etc.
And also be open to new ideas. So be open to considering new information and incorporating new ideas into your own. And a common reaction to encountering new information that challenges your preconceived ideas is discomfort. And know that discomfort is normal. Cognitive dissonance is normal, so discomfort upon receiving new information is perfectly okay.
And we'd like you to be present if at all possible. So we know it's agony not checking Facebook or sending Snapchats or otherwise browsing the internet. We ask you if you could just be present for this next hour, hour and a half. And also thank you for that presence.
And then finally, we have ask questions, right? So please feel free to ask questions without fear that they're silly or stupid, for example, right? Asking questions is essentially how we learn. Be sure to phrase questions in respectful and value-neutral ways, at least the best that we can, right? This is an opportunity to engage in discussion and dialogue. We learn from asking questions that come from a place of respect and by listening to others. We promise that any question that comes from a well-intentioned place will not offend us, right? This is not a challenge, rather an invitation to engage in meaningful discussion and dialogue and to have a meaningful conversation.
Okay, so let's get into it by defining some terms. So we're going to start with civility. Civility is claiming and caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without degrading someone else's in the process. So this means disagreeing without disrespect, seeking common ground, listening past one's preconceptions, staying present, and negotiating interpersonal power so everyone's voice is heard. Essentially, it means being polite and respectful to others. For civil discourse, it's the practice of engaging in a conversation to seek and foster understanding with mutual airing of views. It is not a contest, rather it is intended to promote mutual understanding. You need civility in civil discourse. We will delve more into civil discourse in the following slides.
So when we kind of look at the definitions of civility and civil discourse, we have sort of like an operating perspective in which to kind of have a grounded maybe conversation, right? But the reality is that there's other elements that kind of come into the conversation about civility or civil discourse. So one of those components is consent or consent culture, right? So if this is kind of maybe the first time that we're hearing the term consent or consent culture, let's kind of maybe first define what is consent, right? So consent is to agree to do or allow something, to give permission for something to happen or to be done, right? It really is essentially then, consent then is permission, approval that is ongoing agreement. It is affirming or it is affirmed, right? And never implied. So it's always part of the conversation, right? So when we think about engaging in discussion and dialogue, we're consenting to that engagement, right? We're consenting to having a discussion and dialogue. Consent is something that can be given or taken away, right? It's also then thinking about consent in the terms of having open communication, discussion, and equitable dialogue. So when we look at maybe what is consent culture, so it's really normalizing asking versus assuming or presuming, right? So when we say normalizing asking, we say we really kind of identify like normalize asking to have the conversation, right? To kind of engage in that discussion and dialogue. Consent culture is really then centered and rooted around valuing people and their humanity. Consent culture also focuses on respecting others or respects people and their agency, right? So when we say agency, we recognize sort of like the space that each person sort of occupies. And then finally, consent culture is, and we really can't maybe stress this enough, but asking is normalized, right? People are valued and not objectified.
All right. And then our next thing up is healthy boundaries. So healthy boundaries are a super important aspect of having civility and civil discourse. So we're just going to kind of go over what are some healthy boundaries. What are healthy boundaries? So boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify for themselves what are reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave around them and how they will respond when someone steps outside those limits. A personal healthy boundary can be harder to define. These lines are invisible, can change, and are unique to each individual. Personal healthy boundaries define where you end and others begin and are determined by the amount of physical and emotional space you allow between yourself and others. Personal healthy boundaries help you decide what types of communication, behavior, and interactions are acceptable. And so we want you to just think about like a no trespassing sign. The sign sends a clear message that if you cross that boundary, there will be consequences. This type of boundary is easy to picture because you can see the sign and border the sign, the border that the sign protects. And then we will go on to what are signs of healthy boundaries. So going against persona of values in order to please others, allowing others define you, expecting others to fill your needs automatically, feeling bad or guilty when they say no, giving or taking as much as you can for sake of giving or taking, not speaking up when you are treated poorly, physically touching a person without permission or consent. Example of like hugging. Sometimes it's nice to ask permission. I know that, we tend to, see it as just like a, like a handshake or a common thing to just, go up and hug somebody. But sometimes it's nice to, going back to consent culture, to asking before touching someone. Another, further example is children saying no to a hug. If they say no, you respect their agency. Just because they're a younger human doesn't mean that you disregard that agency.
So now that we've kind of maybe defined healthy boundaries, looking at establishing and enforcing those healthy boundaries, it is pretty important and oftentimes perhaps difficult. Sometimes establishing or enforcing a healthy boundary is easier said than done. But looking at some of the ways that we can kind of maybe do that, first looking at beginning where we feel comfortable, right? So starting with a boundary that maybe doesn't feel overwhelming, and then building on that success to kind of then establish some greater boundaries, right? Keep in mind that establishing a boundary is basically asking for your needs, or kind of identifying your needs, or expressing limits, which kind of flows nicely into the next one of naming your limits, right? So consider what is tolerable and acceptable, consider what feels uncomfortable, stressful, or is anxiety producing, right? Practicing then self-awareness with establishing and enforcing a boundary, really being aware of kind of what is comfortable or what is uncomfortable. Essentially, this is then feelings, these are feelings then that help us know where our boundaries are being tested, and maybe then what those limits are. How we can maybe honor some of those things are by asking, what am I doing, or what are others doing, and what do I have control over, right? The next component is really then giving yourself permission. We might feel guilty for speaking up or saying no, or reinforcing our boundaries, right? I would say embrace that discomfort, because saying no and identifying your boundaries is very important, especially in a conversation where there may be a lack of civility, or there may be a lack of civil discourse, right? And it may be more hostile. Furthering kind of looking at the establishing and enforcing boundaries, consider past and present, right? So when we say this, we kind of look at how we were maybe raised, or maybe like our role within like a family unit or a family structure, and also people we surround ourselves with. So balanced relationships. So, kind of being the peacemaker, if you will, or making sure that everyone is comfortable or okay, maybe is taking away from your comfort or from you being okay, right? So that's kind of what we maybe identify when we say, considering like role in a family type structure or family type unit. Being assertive is also another really great way to establish or to reinforce a boundary. A lot of times this is maybe this is uncomfortable for people, because sometimes being assertive is soul crushing, right? Like we would rather crawl in a hole versus then kind of, be a little bit more assertive with what our needs are. But consider communication style, right? Like just because we're being assertive doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do it in an aggressive way. You can be assertive in a kind way, by simply saying, I'm terribly sorry, but that makes me really uncomfortable, and I don't wish to engage in that discussion or dialogue, right? Seeking support. So support groups, counseling, advocates, or good friends, right? We have lots of different types of support mechanisms, or lots of different types of support structures. One mechanism of support can be friends or family that are sort of like those healthy people in our lives who can help us to sort of identify or reinforce those boundaries, or we can practice those boundaries with, right? Otherwise, looking to counseling resources, right? Kind of seeking out then sort of like that professional guidance, if you will. And then prioritizing self-care. Self-care is maybe a concept or an idea that might be new to some of us. However, this is a really important component. And really, when we say self-care, we're talking about focusing on you, and activities or exercises or elements that allow you to bring yourself maybe a sense of peace, a sense of grounding, really taking care of yourself, right? So giving you that energy, that peace of mind, and that positive outlook, if you will. Essentially, when we think about self-care, think about it in a way of when we are in a better place, we can do better, we can be better, we can show up as our best selves, essentially.
Some great pointers on how to talk with loved ones on the other side, perhaps on a different side politically. This is from this information is from Braver Angels, which is a nonprofit group whose mission is to depolarize American politics. So it's a nonprofit out there. So some of the things they suggest with how to talk with loved ones on the other side. The prime directive, if you can keep in mind, is to try not to change a family member. You can only change yourself. And that, I think, is really important. It's one that I've had to learn the hard way. So it's something I think that is, if you know that's a great starting point. So strategy number one, remind yourself that they are not you. They do not have to change for you to feel okay. So you can calmly hold your own views, listen to others, and live with differences without cutting off important relationships. So that's strategy number 1 with how to talk with loved ones. All right, next slide there, Tim. Oh, there it is. Strategy number 2 from Braver Angels. Remind yourself that you are now an adult who can have adult conversations without reliving the past. Nobody can make you regress into your old self, even if they regress. So just keep reminding yourself, you can direct this conversation. Strategy number 3, because family patterns are usually consistent and predictable, you can prepare and practice how to respond differently. So this is not your first rodeo with your family. So you can really prepare yourself for, dinner with your loved ones. You can regulate or manage your current emotions in the presence of family emotional tides from the past. So those are some strategies from Braver Angels. So specific skills for difficult moments. Stay focused on the topic, if at all possible. Don't fall into the habit of answering baiting questions. Just restate your viewpoint. Don't return provocative statements in kind. So if someone is, disagreeable or, disrespectful, you don't have to do the same. So just really restate your viewpoint. You can agree to disagree and exit the conversation in a low-key way. And when we look at speaking skills, when you say things like, I hear you say, that really is powerful for the other person. You're not agreeing with them, but you're really just validating what they've said. And also, if at all possible, if there's any areas of agreement, that's a real nice place to focus on any areas of agreement. Okay, that's Braver Angels content.
So to reiterate how to engage in civil discourse, just tell the truth. Focus on the truth. Moderate your tone so that you don't sound aggressive. Be conscious and mindful of your facial expressions. Be attentive and considerate of your opponent's point of view. Process what is being said and give equal time to opposing opinions. How to interact respectfully with someone who crossed your boundaries. Respectfully ask for evidence that supports the statements that are being made. Stay calm and consider taking a break from the conversation. Tell your opponent that you don't know how to interpret their facial expression, so ask for help understanding what they mean. And ask for equal time using a polite tone. May I finish my point?
All right. And then, so next up is what we're going to look over some scenarios where civil discourse may be needed, and then kind of just talk, amongst the panel about how we might handle these situations. So our first scenario is a relative brings up politics at the family gathering. You have differing perspectives than they do. How do you handle this situation with civil discourse? So if anybody wants to jump in and go ahead with anything.
Well, what I just said with Braver Angels, you can state something like, I hear you say. So that's, telling them that you're listening to them. You might not be agreeing, but you're listening. So those are some, that's maybe how I would start one of those conversations, one strategy.
If it's something that you are not comfortable talking about, or you feel like it will get out of hand, and you can always, like we talked about a lot before, with healthy boundaries, you can set a boundary with them, and you can say, I'm willing to talk about XYZ. I'm not willing to talk about this. So so I would like us to stay on topic, or to stay away from X topic.
Yeah, I think something important to remember before even starting a conversation is making sure that you're safe in all these different scenarios. Like if you don't feel safe, then just don't engage and just try to, like Luann said, find a low-key way to just exit the conversation.
I think too, focusing on truth, right? Focusing on facts is sometimes a really healthy thing, because sometimes there's maybe sound bites or buzzwords or things that are said that are just not rooted in reality, right? So I think that focusing on truth and fact is sometimes a healthy place to have a conversation, because it can remove like the emotional elements. And I think it was Megan. Sorry, I don't remember who said it, but like kind of just identifying like I'm not okay with having this conversation, or I'm not okay with having this talking about these topics, but I am happy to discuss these other topics, right? Sometimes that's maybe confronted with well, why don't you want to talk about this, right? And if it's a family member, if it's a loved one, I think sometimes the best way to approach that is simply identify, value the relationship over this conversation, right? And I think we all have those people in our lives, those loved ones that it's best if we don't have certain conversations, right? And that we still maintain the healthy relationship.
Yeah, and I'll just say and add that I think sort of going back to healthy boundaries as well is just really assessing what your willingness is to have that conversation. If it's going to be something that is going to do you more harm than good, then you might want to back away from the conversation. I think with family, sometimes it gets really difficult because we have different levels of family members that we engage with that, are sort of have different meaning to us. And so at different times, you might have different feelings as to whether you're willing to discuss those things with the certain family member. So I think it's really assessing your situation, much like Natasha said. So scenario 2 is a coworker brings up religion while in a work meeting and asks your thoughts. How do you handle this situation with civil discourse? So again, I guess I'll just add in a little bit quickly here. This situation is maybe a little bit different because it's in the workplace. So I think we really need to assess our situation again and see, what we're comfortable with, what we can really talk about at work, what is appropriate to talk about at work. Sometimes that may also depend on what your job is. Maybe your job is in part required to talk about these types of things. But if anybody else wants to add a little bit more into specifics about this, that would be great.
I think the place where my brain kind of goes first is, I don't know that that's necessarily an appropriate topic to be discussed, right? So simply identifying, I'm sorry, I don't think that that's appropriate, and I'm not going to engage in that discussion or dialogue. I think is a very appropriate, item to kind of identify that we're just simply not going to have this conversation, because maybe that is very personal, right? I can speak from experience that somebody who identifies as non-Christian, that can sometimes be an unsafe conversation, right? And I say that can sometimes be an unsafe conversation because sometimes there's then just assumptions about, well, what does that mean, right? And I simply identify as non-Christian, right? I don't feel the need to share what my religious or spiritual beliefs particularly are, because those are personal to me. Those are private to me, right? And they're not necessarily something that I'm going to discuss or divulge in a workplace. That is not a personal space. That is a professional space, right?
Yeah, I think really making sure you set those boundaries is for between work and personal is also really important when it comes to these kinds of conversations. I mean, you can just say like, I hear you, but I'm, like Patrick said, I'm not interested in having this kind of conversation at work.
All right.
Should
Does
we
anybody
move on
else?
to scenario 3?
Sure thing.
Okay.
So the last scenario that we have is a classmate says something offensive about your identity. How do you handle this with civil discourse?
Well, I think the first thing is making sure that you stay calm, because when it comes to identity, sometimes that can make people very not calm. And I think just making sure that you keep calm and approach this person in a non-aggressive way, because that could set things off and make them go into a way we don't want them to go.
I think realistically, this will likely feel like a personal attack, right? Because it's about someone's identity, particularly your identity, for example, right? It can often feel very targeted, very intentional, and deeply personal, right? I think sometimes taking a step back, and not allowing yourself to go to like that emotional place, right? But rather remain in sort of like that logical space, and then have that conversation from a logical perspective versus like an emotionally charged perspective, is easier said than done, right? But is a really great way to kind of keep a level head, if you will, right? I think what's unfortunate about that is that sometimes that requires, the person that this feels maybe targeted towards, to be, let's say the adult in the room, right? Or like the bigger person, essentially. Because this other person may be saying these things to, get a response from you, right? That could be an element of that. And at the same time, just recognize that you may not necessarily have to respond at all, right? You could just simply exist in that space with your agency, and choose not to say anything. Sometimes that's the safest option, right? Because it is incorporating identity. It could be maybe a not safe thing to engage in that discussion or dialogue, or to react or to respond, to that statement.
Yep. I mean, and I think if you are going to choose to engage in some kind of conversation, in response to something that they've said, I think it's important to stop and take a second to think about why they might think the way that they think, where they might be coming from, and maybe ask them, why do you think that, or tell me about, about why you said that, right? Because a lot of times people say things out of ignorance, and not out of malice, because they just don't know any better, or it's something that's a norm to them. And they don't stop to consider that someone that they're speaking to might be offended by that, or it might be speaking to one of their identities. So I think it's hard to do that sometimes in that moment, but I think that it's helpful, especially when you're trying to not be in an emotional headspace, when you're trying to be in a logical headspace, to stop and say, okay, well, why are they saying those things, and where might they be coming from? Not that they're correct, but but acknowledging that, okay, well, this person is coming from this background, or and they might not know. So
I'm just reiterating what Megan just said. I think it's really important, if you feel comfortable with that situation, to try and understand that other person's point of view, even if you don't agree with it, just to see where are they coming from, that we might be able to find some common ground somewhere. So again, but if you feel comfortable in that situation. So I thought that was good, Megan.
All right, and then we can move on to self-care.
So just like when we spend a lot of time talking about healthy boundaries, and the reason that those are important is because your headspace, and the way that you function and present yourself and work through something, is really important, that that you're coming from a good place, from a healthy place, before while you're entering the conversation. Another thing, while taking care of yourself, is to make sure that you're practicing self-care. So what is self-care? Self-care is taking time to tend to the emotional and physical needs of you. It promotes your own personal health and well-being, and it can look different to different people. Something that self-care can do for you is help with stress management, to improve your mental and physical health, and to boost your productivity and mood. So types of self-care: spending time with people that mean something to you in your life. It's social time. Taking care of and maintaining your personal space, your environment, can be therapeutic. Doing things that are intellectual, like fostering brain development and stimulating and expanding your mindset or your points of view. Doing physical things, like nourishing your body and maintaining physical health, is good self-care. And recognizing your healthy and practicing self-care can help you recognize your healthy emotions and your unhealthy emotions and stabilize your mood. Spiritual self-care can help you find inner peace and purpose through practices and activities that you choose.
So then, how can you practice self-care, right? Or how can you start practicing some self-care? Again, I think it's really important to identify that self-care can look different for everyone, right? Depending on needs. These are really just a few ideas to kind of start that process of practicing self-care. If you are not already practicing self-care, or maybe practicing enough self-care, right? So again, looking at social, so having dinner with friends, talking, with close family members or close friends. Setting boundaries can also be a really great social activity, to learn to say no, for example, right? Bandwidth is definitely a thing and kind of important. If you have pets, or if you have animals, and if you enjoy playing with them, doing those types of things then as well. As Megan mentioned, then physical exercise, movement and staying hydrated. Simply getting enough sleep, for example, too, is a really great element of self-care for a lot of people. And then also eating, having like a nutritious and like balanced diet, for example, right? Cooking can be a really great stress reliever. For some, it induces stress, right? So identify if that's a stress reliever, then great. If it's not, then don't do that, or in moderation, right? Emotional affirmations, something that is really, I think, a great emotional affirmation, for example, is like positive self-talk. Oftentimes we may engage in negative self-talk of, I didn't do that well enough, or I didn't do this. Whereas if we engage in positive self-talk, it's saying like, oh, I did that really well. Like, here was my accomplishment. And we kind of then maybe notice how that is impacting our mental health, for example, even our physical health. Taking deep breaths. So this may sound simple, but sometimes, just focusing on your breath is something that is very, very simple again, but it can be a really great grounding technique. One thing I think to remember is that our breath is always with us, right? Like, we always have that as maybe a tool or a resource. So in this category, we have four square breathing, which is a grounding technique. So breathing in for the count of 4 seconds, holding your breath for the count of 4 seconds, breathing out for the count of 4 seconds, and then pausing for the count of 4 seconds. So again, doing that maybe twice or 3 times helps us to become grounded if we're maybe elevated. Or if we're just needing to clear our mind and to kind of have that sense of peace or grounding component, it can be a really great element to create that for us. Looking at environmental, organizing your space. Again, for some people, this might bring great anxiety. I'm particularly one that enjoys reorganizing my space. For some, that causes anxiety. But for me, for example, that's something that is kind of a stress reliever, if you will. designating areas for different tasks or activities. So this really kind of puts us in like a different mindset, right? And I think especially if there's a lot of us who have been working from home, especially during COVID or even after COVID, for example, designating this space as my office space. And when I'm in this space, I'm doing these activities, right? But then when I am in this space, this is my home space, for example. And then when I'm in this space, I'm doing these activities, right? Sometimes keeping those physical boundaries of space and activities and kind of like how we utilize that space can also keep us fairly productive, and also really kind of in a maybe a healthier mental state, right? Where we don't feel overwhelmed, we don't feel anxiety, because this is the space that I work. This is the space that I now enjoy as my home space, right? Or I engage with family, or I engage with friends, those types of elements. So kind of keeping those things in mind. Intellectual, so reading a book, being creative, listening to art or music or journaling, or listening to podcasts, right? These are absolutely some really great ways to kind of practice self-care in an intellectual sort of way. Again, if this is a way that you feel re-energized, grounded, and coming from a healthier, more positive place, right? And then finally, spiritual. So spiritual can look very different for all of us, right? This could be meditation. This could be prayer. This could be spending time in nature. This could be volunteering with our church or our community center. It could also be taking time to simply be alone, right? And communing or conversing with whichever deity or non-deity you identify with, right? So I think, again, those elements are really kind of important and personal, and then can also make us have a sense of grounded, or recognizing our place in the universe, right? So these are just some elements to kind of maybe get started with practicing self-care, and kind of feeling more grounded, feeling more stable, right? And then again, coming from that place where then we can kind of show up and be our best selves, and then do our best work.
I just wanted to interject something here quickly. If anyone feels like indulging in the intellectual self-care process of reading a book, I know a place in town where they have tons of them for free. So just show up at the library.
Visiting your local library may be a really great resource for that.
That's true. I've heard good things. And right now it's also very pretty with the evergleams here. So it's a dual practice thing. So I'll be quiet now and move to the next slide.
The last slide is really our resources. So anytime that we kind of put together content, we like to share our resources, right? So if anybody watching would like a copy of the presentation, you're more than welcome to that. Email Tim, and Tim will send that over to you. And then this is the list of resources that we utilize to put together our conversation for tonight.
And if anyone would care to get this PowerPoint, I'm scrolling my email address at the bottom of the screen. It's tkaczynski@manitowoc.org. Just contact me via email, and I will send this PowerPoint to you as soon as I get your request, or the next day if you send it, later at night. But tkaczynski@manitowoc.org. And I will stop that scroll and switch out of this screen. And someone sent something in that was about self-care right at the end of it. So I'll just bring that up since, we were just addressing that. Julia Lee said, for me, self-care often can feel selfish, and so gets set aside. It's good to be reminded, especially at this busy time of year, that taking care of yourself is essential for being your best with others. And thank you to you guys.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is a good reminder, right? there are often times that I hear people say that, practicing self-care seems selfish. And that is true, that it might feel that way. The reality is that it's not, right? Because again, keep in mind that it allows for you to show up and be your best self, right? So if your intent is to be doing good work and to, sort of like be that person that is present, then in order to have that impact, you have to be practicing self-care.
All right, I'm going to move on to some questions that we had submitted from community members beforehand. But before I do that, just a couple of comments that people made. Linda Hunter, thank you for offering this discussion. It's urgently needed, which I completely agree with. I think all of us do. And Danielle Love, simply, this is great. So I know they're very simple, straightforward comments, but I thought they were good to bring them into the conversation at this point. And so let's move on to some questions that were submitted. I'm going to, some of them, definitely apply to what you've been discussing already, but they get a little more specific. So let's just start with this one that someone submitted. Why are we having this conversation? Especially at this time of year, why is it important that we're having this conversation about civility?
Well, I think that especially this time of year, and we're all looking forward to visiting with people that we might not always see on the day-to-day, and sometimes we might anticipate difficult conversations with. I think it's important to be reminding ourselves how to have a civil conversations. And I know we talked a lot about healthy boundaries and a lot about self-care, and really we did that because that's the foundation for being able to then come from a place of honesty and a healthy place to be able to have difficult conversations. And so that is my 2 cents on that.
My knee-jerk response is a conversation about civility and civil discourse is always the right time, right? Like it's always healthy to remind ourselves this is how we human, right? Like this is how we behave as humans, or we engage in healthy discussion and dialogue as individuals who are not the same, right? So I think it's always a good time to have a conversation as reminders of how best to do those things. And like Megan said, I think when we're talking about healthy boundaries, consent, and self-care, and then even with the elements that Luann was speaking about from Braver Angels, right? Of like kind of how to apply those things in certain contexts is, again, some really great reminders, because it allows us to maintain familial relationships, right? Relationships with our family members, that we may have family members that we absolutely do love and care about, and we may not necessarily align philosophically, right? So I think that that's a really important component.
And really finding common ground, bringing people together instead of dividing people. It seems like we've kind of polarized in this country, and if we can do, it would be a better world if we could find common ground and have people, bringing people together versus apart. So I think it's a bigger, it's going to be better for everyone if we learn some of these principles.
Yeah, like the other panelists and Luann have mentioned, we live in a really divided country, and it's just being able to have simple conversations in a civil and respectful way. That's how we can keep doing what we're trying to do and keep being human and keep just having conversations without anyone, without people getting all up in an uproar about things.
Without creating more division.
Yes, thank you.
I think even too, thinking about like shame and guilt, right? Like shame and guilt are some pretty strong driving forces a lot of the time too. And so one of the, I'm thinking about this in the context of like we feel shame, or we feel guilty for like practicing self-care, right? Um, and I think that, where am I going with this? I'm going to a place of shame and guilt are powerful motivators, right? And if we allow ourselves to be authentic, be vulnerable, that really takes the elements of shame and guilt and cancels them out, right? So I think that having conversations about civility, civil discourse, is in a way allowing ourselves to be vulnerable in those ways. And I think we can then again kind of show up and be our best selves, right? So that's random thought, but just kind of came to mind.
Great. Should we move on to the next question?
Mhm.
All right. And this seems, once again, really basic, but why is civil discourse important? And I think you touched on that with your reply in the last one, but would anyone like to add anything more to that? Or do you feel we've covered that? I look to you.
I think we've covered that, right?
Okay.
I think so. Some of our panelists have identified whether it's sort of from a more global perspective or from more of an interpersonal perspective, right? Civil discourse the first word is civil, right? Civility is foundational, and of course we're going to have discourse. Even amongst friends, there's discourse. As long as that discourse remains civil, I think we can avoid some really horrific things, and we can still continue to engage in healthy discussion and dialogue, with boundaries, right? Particularly healthy boundaries that allows us to each walk away from that experience or that engagement with our agency intact.
All right. Then what are some ways to incorporate civility and civil discourse into communications in general with others?
Well, I think I said this in my PowerPoint, but I've actually personally been using this because I learned it in the Braver Angels workshop. Is really when you say, I hear you say this, you might not agree with that person, but it calms things down and they are being heard. And so that's a good way to maybe, start engaging with someone that you don't agree with. Again, if you feel safe engaging with them. So just trying to understand the other person's point of view, even if you don't agree with it. And that piece of information has been powerful for me in many aspects. So I think that was one way that, and it's a simple way, just kind of listening and telling that other person, I heard you say that. That's powerful to them, that you actually heard them say that. They might kind of slow down, or, oh my goodness, she's actually listening to me, and we might find some common ground, or at least understand each other and go away from that conversation feeling respected on both sides.
Yeah, I think ultimately people are looking to be heard. People are looking to be understood, right? So, I think, Luann, you're spot on when you say that when I hear you say, or when I hear you say, right, and you're able to then kind of like repeat back to them some of those elements that they are saying. That, number one, creates that understanding of I'm being heard, right? And I think oftentimes people really just want to be heard. They want to be seen, right? And keep in mind that hearing and seeing is not validating, right? Like you're not, just because you're hearing and seeing someone identify what they're saying, doesn't mean that you're validating that, right? You can still disagree, because then the next step of that is to say, I hear you say X, Y, Z, and I can agree with this. Here's where we maybe disagree, right? Because these are my perspectives, or because this is my view. Or if it's maybe a different type of conversation, utilizing language of like, when you say X, Y, Z, this is how I interpret that, or this is what I'm hearing, and this is how that makes me feel, right? I think those are some really great ways to kind of utilize some of those tools as well.
Okay, and let's move on to the last one that we have submitted. So if anyone following along has questions, please enter them into the comments box. But this is a good last of the submitted questions. Which elements of civil discourse have been easy or more challenging for the 5 of you, and why?
I would say keeping a logical brain instead of letting the emotions get to you. It's easy to just immediately take offense instead of step back and thinking, how can I have an actual conversation instead of immediately going on the offense. So,
Yeah, I agree. That's my hardest part as well, is taking a step back and not being reactive to what I'm hearing, and being able to stop and think about it, and think of something thoughtful to say in response, something that's productive and not just reactionary.
I also think that a big thing for me, and I think in general in civil discourse, is asking yourself why you're having the conversation or why you're getting into the conversation. Is it, that you are wanting to change somebody's mind? Is that even possible to change their mind? Where are they at in the conversation? What is their goal with the conversation? And there's going to be varying answers to those different things. But I think it is important to ask yourself first, what is my goal in this conversation? And is it going to be healthy for me? Is it going to be healthy for the relationship with this other person? And really assessing before you continue to move on. And I think that sometimes that's a challenge.
You bring up a good point, Sonia. I think one of my most challenging is thinking, I'm going to change someone. And that really that goes out the window, that the only person I can change is myself. So that I think has been kind of refreshing for me, that, I can state, my thoughts. I can hear someone else, but if I'm expecting them to change, then that's not going to happen. So really kind of letting that off the table has been kind of a great uplift for me.
I think so easy. I think it's really easy for me to create boundaries. Sometimes too easy. Like the walls of the Citadel, they go up pretty quickly, and they're rather thick. So I would attest that, though, to I think a lot of experiences that I've had with engaging in maybe like discussion and dialogue that is more tense. I think at times, maybe, I don't know. So that would be the easy part. I think the more difficult part for me is, I think, like feeling a sense of calm internally, because oftentimes I can be very calm externally, But internally, it is not calm. And I think just remembering, okay, breathe, take a step back. And I think even just kind of like practicing that mantra like inside of your head can be a really healthy thing, because there is no sense, there is no need to allow that other person, whoever that may be, to have that power over you to elicit such a response, right? And I think that was a really hard thing for me to maybe learn to do. But after practicing it for a while, it becomes maybe second nature, and just recognizing that this is well within my control of how I respond, right? That's my agency. That's my power, if you will, right? So I think those are my thoughts to that question.
So let me kind of change the end of this question a little bit, and this is just to everybody. It's not, to one specific person. Why do you think, why is it just basically that we're human and we're flawed and we hold on to things too dearly, maybe that we shouldn't, or or that we hold on to things that we should, that are really important? Why do you think it's so difficult for in the current world we live in? Why is it so difficult to basically engage in these basic tenets of civility? Why do you feel it is evolved in this direction?
I think for generations, one thing, we haven't been really paying a lot of attention to mental health and to personal, to self-care and to boundaries, healthy boundaries. I think after generations of not valuing those things as much as we should, I think that we have a population of people who don't know how to set healthy boundaries, and they don't know how to practice self-care, and they don't know, because they don't know those things, they don't know how to handle difficult conversations in a productive way. I think that's one reason.
I'll also say, I think that with media, social media in general, we are way more connected than we really ever have been, and immediately. So I think in part that creates discussion and dialogue across platforms and in person, that can have or not have civil discourse. I think it also sometimes pulls people to extremes on ends of issues, because of the more immediate interaction and being able to sort of come together more easily on certain issues. So once we have a group established that is extreme on one end, it causes a bit more challenges, because then you have a group of people instead of maybe a subsect of people prior to social media, that were getting their opinions and thoughts put out into the world, less so than now with social media. I'm not blaming social media, because I love social media. I think it's great. I think it's how we have discussion and dialogue. I think it's how we learn from each other. I am a debater. I love debate. So this is where I learn a lot of my debate from, is online and social media. But again, essentially what I'm saying is that I think, those extremes are a little bit more amplified these days. So I think that that is sometimes what makes it difficult to have more civil conversations, because it is more extreme than sometimes we are used to seeing.
Well, and I think that to piggyback on that, social media can create a feeling of anonymity, or a feeling of a lack of consequence. And so when we would have when people engage in discourse over social media, it feels like there's no consequence. It might feel like there's that it might feel like there's just they don't they have anonymity. They don't need, it's not real, right? But I think that it also creates a feeling like that doesn't translate into the real world. And so when we're in the real world and we're trying to have civil conversation, that's very different.
So a few things agreed with what Megan and Sonia have identified. I think a few other things kind of come to mind for me, and one of those things is groupthink, right? So like each of us kind of being in our own camps, if you will, and stepping outside of that groupthink, or stepping outside of that camp in which we identify with or belong to. It really does require, I think, a certain level of vulnerability that often many of us are very uncomfortable with, right? Or we don't feel safe doing, which is fair and to be respected. I think that it requires a certain level of vulnerability that many of us are uncomfortable with, right? And I think that's I think Braver Angels is kind of maybe like maybe named appropriately, right? Because it kind of requires us to have some sense of bravery to step outside of that comfort and to put ourselves out there and to engage in maybe uncomfortable discussion, dialogue, as long as it's safe, right? There's a difference between safety and uncomfortable. I also think that our beliefs as individuals are really core to our humanity. So because our belief systems, right, are really core to our humanity oftentimes. And to question them or to challenge them is not necessarily something that we're taught to do, right? And I think that can be challenging for sure. I also don't really think that we in general in our society, if you will, we're not really taught healthy boundaries. We're not really taught self-care, right? We're not really taught those types of things, or to maybe engage in meaningful discussion and dialogue that is really centered around conflict management, right? We're not necessarily taught those things. So to learn those things can be kind of an individual journey, or something that we seek out, versus something that is maybe part of kindergarten, for example, or formal education, if you will.
So to kind of sum things up, as we don't have any questions that have come in or anything, how do you think, or what do you think, what is the best manner of going about getting back on the path to civility? What's your opinion on, from all of you, what you think the best manner of righting the ship of civility is, that's the most accessible to everybody?
I really think a big part of it, a lot of time, is just assessing your tone and the types of things that you're saying. So like, having a conversation or a discussion with somebody, and they're attacking immutable characteristics about the other person that they disagree with, or or they're just yelling, or their tone is condescending in some way. Like it's I think that is a huge thing with just being able to have a good conversation, is just sort of watching and monitoring those things for yourself and for the other person, because once those types of things start to come in play, you're not having a civil conversation anymore.
Being self-aware.
And if you're really interested in this topic, again, the Braver Angels is a nonprofit organization, and it would take you on, months-long course that you engage and talk to people on different sides and practice some of these techniques. So I know that different workplaces have sent people to Braver Angels and things like that. So we do have that resource on the resource page. So that's, again, a nonprofit organization that's their whole mission is to depolarize American politics and teach people how to talk respectfully to each other. So that's, if you're very interested in something like that, there's you can go, and there's workshops and trainings going on across the country, throughout Wisconsin, and you'd be able to access that information and maybe even partake in some of those types of trainings that you practice some of these skills.
And even if you don't do Braver Angels, making the conscious effort to practice having conversations with people who you don't about topics that you don't agree on, and practice having those in a civil manner is important to learn to move forward. Yep.
I think, to bounce off what Megan just said a little bit, even sometimes having conversations just with people that do agree with you on something, but maybe they see a different path to the solution. And I think that gives you a sort of way to start, kind of developing and learning skills of like how to have a civil conversation with somebody about something who you disagree with, but maybe in like an even safer, lighter way.
So my thoughts are so I guess the best way for me to answer this is like from my perspective of, I guess, what helped me kind of like build maybe some of my skills, I guess. And that I think is really kind of centered around social awareness, self-awareness, and listening, right? Like, I think sometimes we listen to respond, right? Or we're listening, but we're formulating our response as we're listening. And that's problematic, right? Listening, taking in, digesting, and then formulating a meaningful response takes time. And I think it's more than fair to listen to something and say, I need to think about that, right? Or I need to digest with that, or I need to ruminate in that, right? Mull that over, right? Like marinate. I was on a panel with somebody who had identified that they would marinate in that. And I think that's really kind of appropriate, because sometimes you just need to sit with it, right? And kind of, see how that feels, see what that's like. So I'll just reiterate, self-awareness, social awareness, and listening.
All right. Anything from anyone want to add anything else as a closing statement, a summation, anything along those lines? I mean, I think we've covered a lot, and I think we've covered it well. You all did a fantastic job. Any parting words?
I don't know why, but I feel the need to say this. I think we could almost sum up a lot of the things that we've been talking about tonight in a context of doing no harm, but also not putting up with like, stuff, let's say. When I say stuff, I mean, there's another word that I'd like to use, but truly, coming from that perspective of doing no harm, but also not accepting unacceptable behavior, right? Not accepting harmful behavior, I think is really the root, if you will.
Thank you very much, everybody, for watching and engaging with us. It's always a pleasure.
There was one final comment that just came in that I will share with you because it's a very nice comment. Julia Lee, great job all. Thanks for the important conversation. And I couldn't agree with her more. I'm going to jump back into the picture just because we're wrapping things up. Hello. It's still a little shocking, isn't it? But just to throw a little something, a personal anecdote, I guess. And I had a conversation the other day with a couple. We couldn't be on more polar opposite ends of the political spectrum. And without going into the conversation at all, we had never engaged about talking politics, and I've known them for maybe, I don't know, 5 years or so. And not once had we approached it. And we, for whatever reason, dove into a conversation about politics. And within like 30 seconds, we found common ground. Wow. That we could have the conversation. And I was a little bit surprised, but very pleasantly so, that, just someone at their wits' end, both parties were coming at it, from having had it, too much being thrown at you constantly, that the common ground was so much easier to access than I anticipated. Wow. And that was just great, and so it was very encouraging. And I thought it was also very interesting that it was coming so close to this panel discussion. It's almost like it was planned, but it wasn't. But, so I just in closing, I wanted to say how it's been wonderful working with all of you over this past year on these panel discussions. I couldn't be happier that you approached me about continuing the conversations going. That had to be 9 months ago. Mm-hmm. I completely lost track of time, so I can't tell what is and what isn't. But it's been a genuine pleasure working with all of you, and I don't even really consider it working. I love getting together for these conversations, and sure, technically I'm on the clock, but I really don't think of it as being that whatsoever. So Luann, Patrick, Sonia, Natasha, Megan, it's been great getting to know you more over the past year, and it's just been a genuine pleasure having these conversations. So thank you so much.
We want to thank you, Tim, and the library for being such a great ally and letting us host these conversations.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, I can't imagine a good reason why not to have these conversations. So, well, everyone, thank you for joining us for these conversations this year. There hasn't been a discussion so far about moving it forward, but if that did happen, I wouldn't be terribly surprised. Because I like doing what I like doing. And so this is just phenomenal getting together for these. So, happy holidays, everyone. Stay civil. Engage in civil discourse with everyone, not just your family, but at work, when you're out having dinner. Take this with you, and let's go forward more positively together. So, happy holidays, everyone. Have a great evening, and goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.